In this edition, we'll be discussing strategies to help you better understand your developer consumers and ways to improve your API experiences by having more empathy for developer needs. So how can we have more empathy for developer needs? Well, perhaps not all API providers are empaths like Deanna Troi from Star Trek Next Generation. If they were, they would probably sense their developer desires and know exactly how to construct the best SDKs, the most consumable API documentation, and eloquent code samples for every single use case out there. But as many programmers can attest, it's never quite that easy. There are still many hurdles involved in API integration, which could stunt overall growth. And also, deep customization is not entirely feasible for self-service APIs. But can we at least get closer to that sort of understanding and developer usability? Well, I would argue that yes, it is possible, but it all really hinges on great developer experience, DX for short. API products and internal APIs for that matter, they really must consider the needs of developers in the same way user-facing products consider user experience. So in order to build great developer experiences, I think it's important to fine-tune your onboarding process and all those support materials that help developers on their way. Also, having more data and insights about modern developers could help you paint a better picture of exactly who they are and what they're looking for. So in this hour-long event, we've brought in two experts to share how to better augment your API onboarding experience and how to improve your marketing focus with data-driven insights. And first up, someone who probably doesn't need much of an introduction for the Nordic APIs community, it's Adam DuVander. I was looking at the events he had done with us at one summit, two summit, three summit. There's like 5 platform summits, another tour, some other events. Adam's been great. He is an API veteran, developer communicator, and principal consultant at EveryDeveloper. He was the first editor of Programmable Web, which TechCrunch called the Journal of the API Economy. And he's a frequent speaker on developer experience and developer marketing. His work with developer-focused companies helps to better engage their audiences. And he's been published on Wired, Zapier, SendGrid, among other presences. So he's going to talk about why we should give every developer a quick start. And he's going to share some getting started best practices culled from the best API companies. So Adam, thanks so much for being on the call. Looking forward to your presentation.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Excellent.
Let me pull this up. And yeah, as you mentioned, Bill, I have spoken at a number of Nordic API in-person events. This is the first LiveCast that I've done. Right. And of course, all of us who are here now and participating in this are used to these virtual events formats now. And exactly. So some people may have even tabbed over to their email, and I want to invite them back here and recognize that sort of distraction is actually what we're all dealing with to be able to connect with developers as well. And that's part of giving them that quick start and sort of engineering that process is that we need to kind of break them out of that distraction zone. But I thought I would start with talking about coffee, because I think it's something we all can appreciate, especially those on the West Coast right now, 9 a.m., having our coffee. A few months ago, in kind of the middle of quarantine time, I was out of the habit of going to my coffee shop except for maybe once a week, and they had to move the counter all the way to the doorway for just window service. There was always a really long line, and so one day I was standing there, 10 minutes or so into it, probably was in my email at that time, and finally got to this right before, the person in front of me is ordering, and I heard, what can we get you? And he said, what do you have? And I just felt this frustration bubble up. How can someone be in this line for 10 minutes And, I wanted to say, sir, you're at a coffee shop. Like, there are only so many orders that you might have. But then I found a little bit of empathy for him. I remembered we're all in the middle of a pandemic. We haven't had our caffeine yet. And actually, the large sign that the coffee shop usually has on the wall that says everything you could possibly order is 20 feet away from this person. And really, this was probably his first experience with this coffee shop. And so I realized that because of the pandemic, my coffee shop had to change their getting started approach, and there were definitely some bumps in it. And so today I want to talk about that first experience, all the way from kind of when someone first sees you through really their first success. And I think the middle part is talked about a lot with kind of the time to first hello world, that first experience, but there's some interaction that happens before that first impression. And then really importantly, the stuff that happens after that first experience, what I call the first 100 API calls, but really the first success. So these are the areas that we'll cover. And here we have, 4 minutes maybe for time to first Twilio slide, which is another important metric in API presentations. So thousands of developers every month land on this page, the Twilio homepage. And that may be their first Twilio experience, but many thousands more land on another page like this, which is trying to explain some aspect of Twilio to them. And it might be their first Twilio impression. And many others might be told about Twilio in Slack or somewhere else. They're linked to maybe the homepage, probably not the developer portal. Somewhere you're not sure where they're having that first impression. And there's only so much control you can have over it. And you can't assume that they're going to immediately see your portal page, the exact page you want. And so I thought we could actually play a game here, the Find the API game, real quick. And the way you play this game, think of any company that you know has an API and go to that homepage. This is HubSpot, so a marketer focus for sure. But if we look around a little bit, we pretty quickly can find our way to the API. Interestingly, if you go to their extremely rich footer, there's some partner stuff there, but there's not actually developer focused stuff here. So you have to find it in that dropdown. Contentful kind of covers a lot of the bases, much more developer focused. And so there you see it in that sort of upper header. It's in the resources menu there. And it's in the footer as well. And so think about the ways, what's the place that someone's going to go to and how are they going to find their way to your API? That's part of that first impression. So here's a hard one. eBay. I mean, eBay's primary users are the sort of folks who are looking for 70% off their wristwatch. But the API is a really important part of eBay's business. It drives the power seller tools, which is a lot of their business. So still, eBay 2020 on the homepage in the footer, you can find a way to its API. Now, once you're there at this portal, that first impression is still happening. And I'm sure we have all seen a lot of bad API portals. So what are some ways that you can really make sure that you still maintain that great first impression? Well, we'll look at what a few do that maybe aren't so good. This is AT&T's developer site. And yet, this definitive guide for 5G and AT&T TV, it's very focused on them. And I'm not quite sure as a developer what is in it for me. And actually, the AT&T experience begins even back at a Google search, where they tell me that they bring ideas to life, which as a developer, I'm not quite sure what that means. Now Visa, and apologies if anyone from AT&T or Visa is on the call, but Visa's portal, it looks really nice for sure, and there's some good stuff below the fold. But again, with that self-focused piece, and remember, we're talking about developer empathy, you want to make sure that you're thinking about what they're looking for. And here, this is all about the redesigned homepage, developer homepage, which someone who's seeing this for the first time probably isn't going to know about. And so if I were to change this, I would click into use cases, take whatever's at the top, and make sure that that is brought to the homepage in a way that describes how it would actually benefit a developer. And really, you want to have primarily those benefits, and then this hint of features to be able to at least let a developer know how they would do it. And a good example here is Plaid, which is actually owned by Visa now. So there we go. Visa got a thumbs up and a thumbs down on this LiveCast. But here we see very quickly they let developers know what they're providing, that they're helping your users connect to the financial accounts. And of course, they tell you how to do it. It's with their API. And I mentioned that you can't really control how someone has that first impression, but this is the last one in the first impression section. This is something that you could do to be able to engineer that first impression a bit. And I call it signature content. And essentially it's how deeply can you understand the developer problem and then create the definitive resource to be able to help them do that. And I wrote a post on HeavyBit about it that we can link to, or you can search for. But a couple of examples of it here is Gremlin, which takes a guide to Chaos Monkey. And yes, they do that, but they also meet that developer with a really rich guide that should solve that problem, even if they're not going to use Gremlin. And at EveryDeveloper, we did a guide like this around reverse geocoding for OpenCage. And so the idea here is to be able to engineer that first impression through your knowledge of the problem. And then that is a really great entrance into the first experience, because they already have this really warm and fuzzy feeling about you. And then it will give them a good experience. So if anyone's bought a new car, you actually get something kind of like this first experience. After you've already gone through, maybe the first impression isn't so good on buying a new car, but after you've signed the paperwork, then the salesperson takes you out to your brand new car and gives you a quick tutorial, the sort of thing that will make sure that you don't crash the car before you leave the lot, which I think is probably the bar they're going for there. But what they don't do is give you your manual and say, well, you should probably read all of this documentation before you leave. It's a personalized tutorial that gets you to a minimum bar of, I can drive off the lot without crashing the car. So in developer terms, this is the getting started guide. And I have 3 criteria for a great getting started guide. And that is, you want 1 getting started guide. That seems sort of strange that I have to say that, but in the last 3 consulting projects on developer experience that we've done, in each case, we have found multiple getting started guides for different reasons. So have 1, use it as the primary call to action. You want new developers, someone having that first experience, to go through your getting started guide and make sure that it leads to this quick initial win. Now that's important. It's an initial win. It's not everything. You're not going to say, everything you ever need to know about this API or your business in this Getting Started guide. It's a really short window, that hello world, some initial win that you can provide. Now, I have one caveat to the you have to have only one guide rule. This is API-Matic's developer experience portal. You can see that they recommend Getting Started, but there's also that list of languages. And so you might not have this many languages, but if you support multiple languages, it's great if you can give someone a first experience in their language. So you click Python. There, it's the Getting Started guide that is Python specific. So if you have multiple of those, that's okay, because that's still a single experience. You're pointing a developer toward the one way that you want them to be able to have that first experience. Now, there's something I call click to cloud, which is like the Heroku button, and you can create an initial experience that quickly gets someone set up with something like that. There's a downside to that, I think, for getting started, which is you may skip over some really important context that you would have provided in a tutorial by just letting someone get started as quickly as possible. So I think there is a limit to sort of the fastest time to hello world being always a good thing. There's a time where you would want to make them get to that all the way through to the success. And I think there's kind of a dead end if there's not an obvious next step and they don't have a lot of context. Because really you can see in this timeline, and of course you want this timeline to go way beyond the first 100 calls, but in this timeline, that's the over half of it is that experience they have after the first experience. And so I said 100 calls, but whatever number works for you, and it might not even be a specific number. It might be reaching a certain point or using a number of endpoints in your API. So, but defining what that first success is, and thinking of it in terms of if you sold pianos instead of having an API, that first experience might be, here's how you play a scale or a chord, but that's not going to make me a piano player as much as if you taught me a melody or if you taught me a chord progression. That really is the next step, the first success that then makes me begin to really understand how your piano will impact me, how your API will. Last Twilio slide, I promise, but this is so good I had to share it because they do a really good job of defining use cases in a way that is not product centric. I mean, it is behind the scenes, but they're describing what department are you in your company and what is the way you will use a particular product. So if you can have that be the next step, a way to really be able to help someone zero in on a specific use case. If you have a sample app that is built around that use case that they could quickly deploy, I think this is a great spot for click to cloud solutions. Is you've already had your first experience. Now you need to get to that first success. A sample app can help you do that. And then being able to look at where they get stuck. There's a lot of people who will have that first experience and won't go beyond that. Are there analytics, either web analytics or API analytics, you can dig into to figure out where are the places that they're getting stuck. And I have another post about how we did this at Zapier and how we discovered that what we thought was the developer audience really wanted a visual builder, not the CLI that we'd built. And we went through several iterations to get to that epiphany. And it involved seeing where people get stuck. And so I want to leave you with this idea that there's always a next step. There's always a next step for your developers and also for you to help create this great experience for your developers. And so I want to ask you today to think about this timeline that I've mentioned. And right now, before your head is full of wonderful data that we're going to get about developers, pick one of these areas: the first impressions, the first experience, or that first success to focus on. And then within one of those, choose a project. I want to do better at my getting started. And write that down now, or if you've tabbed back over to email again, send yourself a quick note, and let's all work together to build a better experience for our developers. So thanks.
Excellent. Thank you, Adam. Awesome presentation. So Visa and AT&T, you just got a free developer experience audit. I think they should be very happy rather than offended, hopefully. Yeah, awesome insights, great points throughout. I really like how these two presentations are gonna piggyback on one another, because we just got a great introduction to like the real world developer experience, the kind of visual component and stresses that developers go through when they're trying to integrate with your product. But now we're gonna see some hard data, to make another Star Trek reference slightly, from Christina. And Christina, I am so sorry, I forgot. I'm a terrible person. I forgot to ask how to pronounce your last name.
That's all right, Bill. Anyway, it will be Greek to everyone. It's Voskoglou, but I'm not offended if people cannot pronounce it. So just Christina will do.
Christina, thank you so much for being on the call. For an introduction here, Christina is passionate about bridging the chasm of understanding between companies and their customers, whether consumers or developers, through data and research. Her life's mission is to try to make the world a slightly better place by advancing fact-based knowledge, promoting understanding and cooperation between communities. As the Senior Director of Research, she is responsible for all of SlashData's research products, and she heads the analyst and product teams. So it seems like in this session, and based on data from their developer economics surveys, that, I mean, you guys survey about 30,000 responses annually, right?
30,000 developers annually.
Yeah,
that's
right. Pretty impressive. So Christina is going to be looking at those responses and discussing things like the relative size of the API and non-API developer communities, hopefully answering some sort of questions like how many developers use APIs versus not, in which development areas is the usage of APIs more prevalent. And I think she has many more insights to share, should be very valuable. So yeah, without further ado, I'll just let you get on with that. Actually, one small note, we're just gonna do the presentations back to back. I'm seeing some great questions coming up. Keep them bottled up. I promise we'll get through all of them after the end of these two presentations. So yeah, Christina, I'll stop my share and go ahead.
Yep, thank you. So hopefully you can see my screen. So yeah, thanks, Bill. We'll be discussing today with hard data, as Bill said, how the API and non-API developer communities differ, both in size and then in profile. Before I actually do that, because exactly I'm going to show you a lot of data today, I'm sure you want to know where this data comes from. So as just said, we survey more than 30,000 developers annually. And based on this data, we focus on three areas. We understand, explain who developers are, which is our main focus today, what they buy, so what technology choices they make, and where they're going next. We're trusted by the leading tech guys in the industry there. And how we collect our data. First of all, we cover 10 development areas that you can see here on the left, from the more mature ones, such as mobile, desktop, web, and cloud, to the more emerging ones, such as AR, VR, and third-party ecosystems there at the bottom. That means platforms as CRM platforms, voice or messaging platforms. So these are development areas. These are not distinct development profiles. I'm sure you know that developers are active in many of those at the same time. So full stack developers categorize several of those. And therefore, that's why I consider it very important to cover all of those in a single survey so that we capture the full picture of what these guys are up to. So we run 2 surveys annually. We reach developers in more than 159 countries each time. And we do that through more than 87 channels every time. By channels, it's everything, it's from small local meetups to really large vendor communities. And our effort there is to make sure that we represent all small pockets of developers out there, so the whole population. Okay, so what we'll be discussing today, first of all, I want to add some context here, how many developers there are in this world, and how this is expanding. Then we'll look into APIs, so how many are actually using APIs, and therefore we'll just prove that APIs have taken over the software world. And then the main focus is, of course, about understanding developers. So it's not just about the statistic of how many, but actually it's about who. And then we'll just wrap up with some conclusions and further questions here. Right, so the size of the developer community. I obviously don't have the time now to explain in full our methodology here, but in a nutshell, we combine 5 different sources of external data with our survey data, and happily those independent estimates converge to a single one. I'm all ears and open to any questions as to how we do that, but for now, this is just a nutshell. We have been doing that for quite some time now, so we have been tracking how developer community evolves. There are currently therefore 21.3 million developers out there, and we expect that number to grow to 23.6 in a year's time. So as you can see, the growth has been substantial. We've seen more than 26% of growth in 2 years. So I guess the question there is, how does this grow? What lies behind it? First of all, you need to understand how this breaks down into local communities, and they're all not growing the same or behaving the same, as I will show you in a minute, which is quite important in shaping the global trends. So yes, North America and Western Europe are still there at the top as the largest communities. However, we have emerging regions that are really expanding really fast. So Middle East and Africa has grown by 28% in the last 6 months, while Western Europe didn't really grow. We observed a marginal drop actually in size, 2%. We need to keep an eye on it and see whether that's temporary glitch or a real trend. But my point here is that it's the regions obviously have different sizes, but how these grow and how the mix changes really affects global trends, because each one of these local communities behaves differently. Okay, and on to the API community. So as I said, we need to understand where this growth of the developer community has come from. So we find that nearly 90% of all developers out there use APIs. And we said that there are 21.3 million developers in total, so that implies that the community, the API community, actually numbers 19.1 million members currently. So that actually is a proof, or at least an indication, that APIs are behind the boom that we observe. Is one of the key drivers. There are others, obviously, but it's one of the key drivers, since 90% of the booming population uses APIs. And of course that happened because APIs lowered the barriers to entry in the ecosystem by enabling the less experienced developers to quickly and easily build applications, and therefore get into the whole space quite easily. Now, we also asked developers what categories of APIs they're using. I'm not going to stay here a lot too long. We asked about 17 different third-party APIs, and these are the top 10 categories. The key point I want you to take from this is that developers who do use APIs use on average 2.9 different categories of them. So nearly 3 different categories, right? That means that API usage has penetrated several different aspects of software development, and therefore they use APIs to build different features and add different functionalities to their apps, which is also very important and explains how things have evolved. So just briefly on the ranking here, you'll notice that payments is there at the top, one of the two most popular, along with location and mapping. There's also another category, which is finance and banking. Didn't make in the top 10, but only marginally so. So the fact that these two are quite popular says quite a lot about the future of mobile and web payments, and also finance and banking applications. It also shows that at least 1 in 3 developers don't really share the security concerns that existed mostly a few months ago maybe, or still exist with respect to security. And the other point is that other categories that are towards the top, such as email, messaging, and payments also, are more related to business functions and also the most established ways of communication, while at the same time video, as you can see, is towards the bottom, and voice is even further down, not even making to the top 10, because these are more demanding ways of communication when it comes to internet usage. Okay, so who is using and not using APIs? As I said, this is a focus for today, and I'm going to show you different slicing of the population to understand how they differ, because as I said, you need to go deeper than the 90% statistic to understand the patterns and therefore predict them. So beginning with professionals versus non-professionals, we asked developers how they're involved in each one of the development areas in which they're active. They can be either professional students or hobbies, and they can be different things in different sectors. But as long as they're professional in one sector, then they're professionals for our needs here. If they're non-professional anywhere, then they're only hobbies or student. So on the right here, the first thing you see, there's a huge difference in API adoption between professionals and non-professionals. So only 7% of professionals don't adopt APIs, as compared to 20% of hobbies or students. That says quite a lot, because it means that professionals who rely on what they do to make a living on development, they do see the value of using APIs, and they think it worthwhile to invest money and time into using one in their applications. So that says a lot about the recognition of the value that APIs can bring. And of course, professionals also use more internal APIs as compared to hobbies, as they're more likely to be working in organizations that have developed their in-house solution. Perhaps what is odd here is the 16% of non-professionals who use internal or private APIs. Well, we find that this is mostly either students doing research and for using internal APIs to the research organization or academia or somewhere, or otherwise people experimenting with their own API somehow. Right, another way to slice the data is and see how API usage differs is by region. Remember, I told you that we should be keeping an eye on the way that different regions grow, so the relative way in which they grow, because they can affect the global picture. And this is why. So I have ranked things, I have ordered things here by the popularity of third-party APIs. So as you can see, there's a huge difference between the first region here, which is Middle East and Africa, and the last one, which is East Asia. So we have 77% of developers in Middle East and Africa using third-party APIs, as compared to 61 in East Asia. And there's no huge difference, however, in overall adoption, at least in the first 5 or 6 regions. But East Asia overall has the lowest usage of APIs. So 15% don't use APIs at all. So looking at this picture, you have to start thinking immediately the next level, the one level deeper than this. So what is behind this picture? What is different in these regions? Well, quite a lot of things. But to begin with, as an example, we know that, for example, in Middle East and Africa, we have a very vibrant and emerging community. You have startups, there not as such a mature mature developer community yet. So as we saw, they're more likely to be using third-party APIs there. While in East Asia, we know that there's a quite large community of C and C++ developers who are also a relatively large community of developers into robotics and computer vision. And these guys prefer to get their hands dirty with low code. So that's one way in which regions can be different. There's also difference between development areas. I'm listing all 12 here that we track. In this case, I've ordered things by total usage of APIs. So you see there's a big difference from the first to the last one. So developers who build apps for third-party ecosystems are most likely to be using APIs. Only 4% of them don't, as compared to 14% of game developers. And again, you need to dive deeper and understand why. In this case, for example, for these two groups that I just mentioned, obviously in games, we see quite a lot of hobbyists, who, as we saw, are not the keenest users of APIs, while we have quite a lot of professionals building extensions to third-party ecosystems. However, this cannot be the explanation behind the relatively low usage of APIs among desktop developers, because we do have quite a lot of professionals there. So there are other factors as well, such as the type of project they're working on and many other considerations. So another such consideration or factor is company size. So we like to see how API usage varies with company size. So in this case, we find that there's no real difference when it comes to overall usage. You can see the red line there. The bottom is quite flat, which means that developers across all or companies of all sizes, they make similar usage of APIs. What does change is the degree to which they use external or public APIs as opposed to internal ones. And as you can see, of course, the usage of third-party APIs goes steadily down with company size. And it makes sense. And of course, usage of internal APIs goes up respectively. And it makes sense because the larger the company, they can take advantage of economies of scale here. And it pays in most cases to build an in-house API instead of keep paying for a third-party one. So, but what is mostly interesting here, and I'll sort of flip this around, is that even so, we have 60 to 65% of enterprise developers, so those working in companies of at least 1,000 employees, we have 60 to 65% of them using third-party APIs, which means that third-party APIs are being accepted in large organizations already. So that's for me the key takeaway. And last but not least, another way to slice the data would be by role. We track many roles. I'm just showing you a few here for illustration purposes, just to show you again how things can differ by role. So again, these are sorted by overall usage, and you see there's a huge difference from top to bottom. So at the top there, we have CTOs, so technical managers really, and also specialists, so DevOps specialists, architects, and so on. So they make the widest use, the largest use of APIs. Only 3 to 5% of them don't use APIs, as opposed to artists, creators, and game designers. And at the bottom there, where nearly 20% of them don't use APIs at all. And there are other differences. I won't go into the details. This is just to show you that by role, there's also a difference in API usage. So putting all of that together, what I just showed you is just scratching the surface, really. So first of all, the global developer community is growing, currently 21.3 million. And you need to understand what's behind that growth so that you can, of course, forecast it and ride the wave. And we saw that 90% of developers use APIs, and therefore clearly APIs are strongly linked to the boom of the developer community. But you need to go one level deeper than that 90% statistic and understand who is using what, because understanding developers is the cornerstone of effective DevRel activities. And as an example, we showed that game developers, hobbyist creators, and developers in East Asia are among the least likely to use APIs, for example, although more than 75% of them do so anyway. And we also showed that 1 in 3 developers working in large organizations use only internal private APIs. However, this is not the recommended way forward when you're trying to understand developers. What you should be doing is start by identify API usage pattern. So not just going looking into the overall popularity of categories, but identifying patterns, which categories are used together, for example, in which types of projects, where are internal APIs mostly used, and so on. And once you have identified these different patterns, then you need to link each one of those with the developers behind them. So paint the profile of the developers behind each one of those API usage patterns. And then for each one of these groups, in turn, understand their key challenges with API development and the key needs. What are they after? What are they looking for? Which features would they want to see? And once you have understood that, you can then adopt a targeted approach to talking to each one of them, addressing their specific needs and their specific challenges. And in so doing, you can also prioritize all these activities based on the size of its segment and how relevant it is to your product. And that was mostly from me. You can also go here, developerpopulation.com, and play around with our developer population calculator. It's free, no strings attached. And you can just use the filters there to see how the developer community sizes, different subpopulations and how big they are. And that's all for me.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Christina. As a journalist covering the API economy, reports and data like this is like honey to my ears. It's awesome. Yeah. It's really important to help carry the space forward to understand who are actually using these services. I mean, big takeaways for me is that APIs are super global, and these sort of business utilities, like you mentioned, location, payments, email, messaging, social, it doesn't really matter where you're located on Earth. Anyone is going to be needing these similar services, regardless of country. So it's cool to see it so widespread and used throughout the world. Other things about the use of third-party APIs dropping with company size, that's interesting, but not as surprising. I think APIs have been part of the startup world for years, but it's interesting to see that build and kind of grow into larger companies as well, as you mentioned. Yeah, so there's a lot of abstraction, a lot to talk about from a report like this. Just really appreciate you sharing this kind of data with us. Really cool. I do have a segue to kind of kick things off for Q&A. Yeah, you guys ready to start talking maybe?
Sure. I guess I should stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, that'd be cool. We'll just go to person. Adam, I think you're still on mute.
Yeah. I'm here.
Still paying attention there, Adam?
Yeah, that was some awesome data. I found myself going through and trying to get screenshots in time, and then that link at the end is like gold for sure.
So good. I'd like to kick things off with thinking about market segmentation, because one of the first questions we're getting in Q&A is from Nicoletta, and well, first off, she's saying Deanna Troi is awesome and Star Trek Next Generation is the best, which I completely agree. But her point is that she's asking, is it bad to have multiple getting started guides? What if I have it by product, like SMS and voice, for example? And I thought it was interesting that Christina's last kind of piece of advice is to try to have some sort of targeted approach to addressing, specific needs of these different groups. And she's saying it's really not really about specificity versus simplicity. So yeah, maybe Adam, Could you talk to that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, that is tough if you have sort of the multiple potential routes that someone takes. I think that having a primary first step to have them have that first experience is still important, and likely, remember, someone's first impression might come from many different places.
Right.
And so I used that Twilio example of someone lands on an SMS, sort of SMS and MMS page where there's kind of a guide about it. That person's next step would very likely be the send your first SMS.
Right.
And that would not make sense if the primary getting started is voice, then that wouldn't make sense for them. But they would be coming from that first impression. And so I was talking more, if someone's at your portal, you've got to tell them what you have, and you have to grab their hand and guide them a particular way. And so I think making a choice there for what that is as the primary way to get started is good. And then, of course, having use cases that can guide them to the specific areas is good.
So it sounds like it's okay to have specific getting started guides to, these niche products, as long as you're having total control of that marketing funnel, right? Because I know a lot of your advice, you talk about this marketing funnel, and I think you recommended a book on this kind of topic recently that I picked up and tried to read. How much does that play into like building up your developer portal?
I mean, I think that you can use those concepts to be able to understand where people get tripped up and where they stop.
Right.
So it's less of a traditional funnel in the you're leading someone through to some sale, and more kind of a mini funnel of their experience. You're leading them through to that first success.
Gotcha.
And so if you can look at metrics that help you determine how they're doing on that, then that will help you to be able to find the spots where there's a big drop off. So I think that model can work for sure.
Interesting. Yeah, and that was one of my questions for you, Adam, because you did mention it's good to track the developer journey, and we need to keep track of their process. But how can we be doing that? Are there any tools or best practices to kind of find that data?
The example I briefly touched on that I linked into the invisible portal was truly just Google Analytics, and we knew that someone arrived at this page where they had to choose whether they were going to use the CLI or a visual builder, and we tried everything we could to point them the direction that we thought they would have the most success with, which was CLI, and just, I mean, the data was super clear that even when we we took a button away and made it really hard to go, people still wanted to go that way. And so it's kind of, there's a natural direction that a developer will want to go. And so, even just looking at Google Analytics can help you. I mean, one thing you can try to do is maybe have a multi-step version of a tutorial. It's a little bit controversial to say that, because sometimes developers want to be able to show me everything. And so you'll see, if you look at Heroku, they start in that multi-page version, and then they have a show me everything button that you can choose to see the view of the full thing.
Right.
But by starting in that, they're actually able to see where someone drops off.
Yeah.
And then, of course, they could also see that on their own, in their own systems, right? Like, are you making an API call or are you not? Then that tells you whether someone has had at least that first experience.
Yeah, and there's a lot on API analytics and monitoring that we're not going to get into in this session, but that's a whole beast of its own. I also noticed a lot of APIs sort of creating a security getting started guide. Do you recommend that as a focus? Because what if the authorization mechanism applies to multiple microservices?
Yeah. So I think that should be part of a getting started. I mean, a big piece of that, like that's often the biggest hurdle to get over is how do I actually authenticate my app?
Yeah.
It definitely helps if your API supports standards that everyone is used to. That can having OAuth, if there's user data that's accessed as part of it, is going to be a much smoother way to get started because developers are used to that. So not being creative with your auth is a good step toward that. But yeah, it should definitely be part of that getting started. It makes sense to have an authentication section. I definitely look for that when I want to figure out how someone authenticates. But I would duplicate that into a getting started guide just because that's such an important part of that first experience.
Cool. Christina, don't mean to not have you in on this as well. I mean, maybe you'd like to weigh in on some practical insights or recommendations on using analytics and maybe this more real-time data to help to market to developers?
Well, the only insight I can say is that I can offer here is that even with analytics, it would be great to combine. So not just use analytics, but also use other sources of information and data, and try to understand who your visitors are to begin with, who your users are, and my point, what I tried to convey here is that it's it really pays off to segment your audience and understand who is behind each one of those journeys, and what exactly are they looking for. They will not all be looking for the same thing, and following the average picture will not get you there, because I mean, developers are not just developers. They're different people, and they have different businesses, maybe, or different motivations at least. And therefore, you need to understand not just the stats here. Of course, you do want the stats. It is your starting point, but you also need to understand how to improve those stats. And the way to understand that is to go one level deeper and understand who is behind all these statistics. So that will be my perspectives here.
And I think one of our viewers had a follow-up question. Do we have any good picture of API numbers and statistics for the United States specifically, or is a lot of what you're talking on looking just at the global trends? Like when you're talking about the CIO or CTO are the most likely to use APIs, for example, is that just covering the entire globe, or do you have region-specific ideas?
So I can have, if I analyze all this data, but
Where
I
are your other
haven't at the moment. As I said, so North America is 4.7 million at the moment. Obviously, more than half of that is the US, way more than half. And there are regional differences. So I cannot tell you what's the mix in there for roles and so on, but again, we would need to see how they follow, what's their clusters in there, what profiles you get in there. It's not a single thing, the US developers using APIs, but more or less, because they're such a big part of the global community, they do shape the global picture here. So most likely if we just aggregate US developers, you get to see the pictures that I showed globally, and I did show North America there for a moment, so that's mostly US anyway.
Yeah, it's super interesting. I mean, Nordic APIs itself, we're a pretty global presence. I mean, I'm in the US, but the rest of the team members are in Sweden, and obviously the Platform Summit is in Stockholm. So we see a lot of European news and insights around APIs pretty often, as well as the North American take, and other countries, of course. But what we've noticed in the last few years is a lot of emphasis on banking APIs, like with the introduction of PSD2 and all the regulation that is encouraging banks to open up with APIs, or mandating it in Europe, I should say. And then it seems like some banks are following suit in other countries. So that was one of my follow-up questions. I mean, you did say that finance and banking was nominally in the top 10, but have you noticed any other trends around that and its impact in the API market?
What we have noticed is that we also track industries and how developers spill into those industries from just software development industry. So, and it is one of the growing sectors in terms of developer community. So there are more and more developers employed there. So obviously that's for a reason. They're trying to build, applications for their banks and finance organizations. And we also see, of course, through also our clients, vivid interest there for developer communities. They're trying to build their communities, and therefore we will actually be looking into mobile payments and payment APIs in quite a lot of depth in our next survey.
Yeah.
So next time I'll have more to tell you.
Oh, great. Good to hear. Also, have you noticed any trends that could be attributed to the global pandemic?
Yes, we have. So we asked last time developers what are their needs that came about as a result of COVID. And it was quite interesting to see that needs are not the top priority ones. They're not really technical. What they need mostly support with is, first of all, flexibility in how they work. I think need for more tooling and APIs and stuff was third or so, if I remember correctly. But otherwise, they need support in training. So what has suffered, obviously, from the whole situation is events, live training, and so on. So they're asking for support along those lines to be trained on the technologies rather than more tooling per se. So that's one interesting.
All right, great. Well, yeah, Christina, thanks so much for sharing your insights here. Is there any great way for people in the API community to stay in touch with SlashData? Have you guys published an API specific report yet, or is this just like a segment of a larger study?
Not yet, but it's coming. And what we will be publishing next week, actually, I think, or this week actually, is our State of the Developer Nation report that covers several aspects of development. One is about COVID that I just mentioned. We're looking into DevOps and a different number of topics, so you may want to have a look. And otherwise, please get in touch. We'll be happy to, and hello@slashdata.co, and we're happy to answer any questions you have. There's a lot of data there to crunch. In our API specific publication, this will be a premium report, so not a free report. However, we will be going a lot deeper into the challenges, which we asked about, and the features that they're after.
Awesome. All right, well, everyone who's watching, be sure to keep track of SlashData for those new reports coming up soon. And we're also going to be publishing a follow-up article by Christina shortly in the coming weeks, which kind of digs more into this topic. Maybe let's just round up things. I think this has been a great hour. Adam, Christina, any final thoughts on what it takes to be a developer empath?
Yeah, I mean, I think putting yourself in their shoes and thinking about that timeline and how you can have some impact in one of those spots.
Awesome. Yeah, Christina, any final words?
Yeah, to be an empath, you first need to understand that each individual is different.
Yes.
That there's no such thing as an average developer. The same way there isn't such a thing as an average person. And to really connect with them, you need to understand them. And it's always far more important to ask the right questions than, assuming you have all the answers just by, looking at market level statistics.
Right. Excellent. All right, everybody. Thanks so much. I'm not going to ask you any more questions. Let's just call it there. I do have some sign-off notes that I'm going to share. So yeah, this has been the Developer Empathy LiveCast. Thanks so much for watching. We'll be posting this to YouTube, or maybe you are watching it on YouTube right now. Oops. We have not many updates because things are going pretty usual at Nordic APIs aside from the physical events. Until we do open up with the Platform Summit and the Austin event in the future, there are ways to participate. If you love APIs and have some thought leadership to share, our blog is open for community contributions. You can look at our Create With Us page on our website for more information about that, or just email me directly. I can be reached at bill@nordicapis.com. We do maintain a newsletter. We're pumping out a lot of different API stories from all over the industry every other week. Promise not to spam you with that. I do want to give a shout out to Assembly AI. They were voted our best public API of 2020. And this was the first year that it was the third year holding the competition, but the first year that we got a panel of judges together. And like Adam was participating in that, for example, and some others from around the space. Yeah, and that was great to see. I think we got some great feedback that we were able to send to all the contestants, and they were super grateful for that. So yeah, Assembly AI, we're going to be reviewing them shortly on the blog, and we'll hopefully be opening up the competition next year as well. Like I said, until it's safe to be physical, there are other ways to participate with Nordic APIs. We're holding these live casts actually once a month through February right now. So if you would have some interesting ideas to share, submit a talk at our speaker proposal link, and we could consider you for one of these webinars. And thank you to Curity, sponsor for Nordic APIs. So we'll end it right there. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.